G'day and welcome back to MotoringBox. On today's episode, I'm going to be performing a few sneaky modifications to the intake of my BA Falcon XR6 Turbo. Now, when it comes to modifying the intake of a Barra turbo like this one, the sky is literally the limit with what you can do. Some people like to pull out the stock airbox and actually put a turbo side intake, which means you have to relocate the battery to where the airbox currently is, and then fit a pod filter and then an intake pipe which goes straight into the turbo. And that's all well and good if you really want maximum induction noise, which would be great. But the trouble with doing a modification like that is it pretty much means straight away you need to get rid of the stock crossover piece which houses the cold and hot side of the intake. So if you're going to do a turbo side intake, you have to get rid of the rest of that and basically swap the intercooler as well to a flow-through style rather than a return style, which this car has as standard. So your car's intake basically goes straight into the turbocharger, down through the front bar through the intercooler, and then pops back up on the passenger side and then runs into the throttle body. So really, it's kind of an all or nothing proposition. Now, I don't want to do any of that today. I actually want to keep the stock crossover, the stock airbox, and basically everything as it is. But I just want to try and open up the system a little bit more. So what I'm actually going to do is install one of these. This is actually an FPV Typhoon Under-Headlight intake. It's a stock Ford part. And apart from the FPV Typhoon, I understand that the BA XR6 Turbos actually had this as well. I haven't had a look in the engine bay of any of those cars, so I can't confirm, but it is nice to know that there is a factory part that I can actually install into my airbox to get a little bit of extra noise and perhaps a little bit of extra power. But let's be honest, if I can just get a little bit more induction noise, I'm going to be completely happy with this mod. Now, there will be some cutting involved in the lower half of the airbox in order to install this, but I've found a template online to help cut the hole and it should be pretty easy to install. Now, apart from the Typhoon Under-Headlight intake, I actually got a new high-performance air filter which I'm going to install as well. This one's from BPR, Bullet Performance Racing, and it promises to be a slightly better flowing filter. And the filter in my car is probably due for replacement anyway, so I think it doesn't hurt to throw in a slightly more high-performance option. So I'm going to throw that in as well. So the first step really is to pull out the airbox and we'll go from there. Right guys, so it's really easy to remove the airbox from an XR6 Turbo. You just have to take the two screws off the intake snorkel. There are two bolts at the back here and one at the front for the airbox itself. We just need to unclip this lid and then basically put the whole top half of this to the side. Now, before I get started, a few people have questioned why I always wear gloves. And yeah, I know it's a little bit inconvenient sometimes when you're trying to do tight little things like unscrewing nuts and things like that. Makes you a little bit more clumsy, but I tell you what, when it comes to cleaning your hands at the end of the job, you pretty much don't need to do anything because there won't be a single skerrick of grease anywhere. And they really do protect your hands as well from all the little sharp edges, which can absolutely shred your hands after a day working on a car. So to get started, we'll have to take the snorkel off. You can also unclip this airbox lid as well, just to pull him out of the way. Get rid of our old filter. Doesn't look too bad, but it'll still be good to swap it out. And we'll just try and put the lid to the side. There we go. So here we can get a really good look at the bolts we need to undo. There's one down the front here you can't really see, but I think it's an 8mm, yep, an 8mm socket on two extensions because it is a fair way down there. I have heard it's quite difficult to get this third bolt reinstalled because the under-headlight intake really goes straight over the top of where our extension needs to go down. So that's going to be interesting. Some people apparently just leave it undone so that the airbox is only being held in by these two at the back, which I guess would do the job. So we'll take our bolts out and we'll put them somewhere safe. And we'll just shorten our extension a little bit here to get these two at the back. All right, that's those two out. And I dare say, yeah, we'll have to take the snorkel as well. So now we should be able to pull our snorkel out of the way. There we go. Just leave the snorkel sitting in place, and then we can pull out the lower half of our airbox. So there is actually a template which I'll put up on screen, which helps you cut the hole for the under-headlight intake, which is going to install right here. So let's pull this out of the car and we'll refer to that diagram and start mapping out a line on the front here to help guide our cut. So before we get started, here's a quick look at the cut diagram. As you can see, we need to cut a 120mm by 58mm hole, and spaced off on each side by the dimensions shown. So 16mm from the bracket on the bottom, 7mm from the existing inlet moulded bit of plastic on the left, 54mm from the top, and then roughly 20mm from the right hand side. So what I'm going to do firstly is measure up 16mm from the two brackets here on the bottom, and then mark two little notches with my Stanley knife, and then score a really light line between the 2 points. This will give you the bottom edge of the cutout. Next, I'm going to measure 7mm off the rounded edge of the existing airbox inlet, and again scoring a faint line with the knife. Next, I'm going to measure down 54mm from the top, and as you can see, it pretty much lines up exactly with where these 3 fins disappear into the body of the airbox. So score a faint line along here, and then we can finally measure off the right hand side. And before you measure off the right hand side, just double check that the opening you've started to map out matches the 120 by 58mm hole, before scoring a faint line, and then we can get ready to start cutting it out. And lastly, I'm just going to roughly hold up the under-headlight inlet to see if it matches up with the scoring lines I've put on the airbox, and so far so good. So in order to cut out this hole in your airbox, it'd be ideal if you had a small cutting disc like on a Dremel or a similar tool. I don't have any fancy tools like that, so I'm simply going to drill out a hole in every single corner and then cut it manually using a coping saw. I find it really difficult to cut accurately with a coping saw, so don't judge me on what this hole is about to turn out like. So all I'm going to do here is feed the blade of the coping saw through one of the holes, retighten the coping saw itself, and then begin cutting the 4 sides of the hole. Try and keep within the guidelines if possible, because if you undercut the hole a little bit, you can easily cut it a little bit further, or use a file of some kind to file your way down to the line. As you can see, some of my cuts are really quite far off here because I find it really hard to control a coping saw. I find it tends to go off in a particular direction and then it's really hard to get it back again. But luckily I've cut inwards from my guidelines, so I can easily come back and recut the particular area that I need to fix, or simply use a file to get myself down to the line. So as you can see, my outline here is far from neat, but the really cool thing about this under-headlight snorkel is that it's got a really big flange of sorts on the place where it connects to the airbox, so it's really going to cover up any inconsistencies you've got on the hole that you've just cut out. And the intake itself is made from a fairly soft rubber, so you should be able to bend and mold it exactly as you need it to be. So all we need to do is try and force the intake into the hole, and it should slot in really nicely top and bottom with the 3 existing fins on the inside of the airbox. It's a really neat design, and if you've cut your hole fairly accurately, it should line up really nicely and fit snug. Now I'm sure when you saw my cutting quality, you're probably worried with how this was going to turn out, but check it out, I think it looks fantastic. So let's get it reinstalled. Alright, and now for the fun part, which is trying to reinstall this back into the engine bay. So there is a nice little gap here beneath the headlight and above the air conditioner compressor line. So I'm going to try and feed this down here, trying not to break any clips or anything. Try and guide it into the gap. It's pretty tight, but I reckon if we just force it a bit, we should get, there we go, a nice easy insertion. So we'll try and push that in there as much as we can, and then it's just a matter of reattaching all the bolts to get that airbox reinstalled again. Now I see what people are talking about online about getting that 3rd bolt in. I reckon it's not going to happen, but the thing about it is once we've got these 2 here tightened up, this end here is wedged in really good under the headlight, so it probably doesn't need that 3rd bolt anyway. So let's get these other 2 reinstalled. All right, see that's in there pretty good. I trust it, it's not going to go anywhere. Now we can get our new air filter installed. Now this one, as I mentioned, is from Bullet Performance Racing. Now I bought this one because it had some good reviews on FordXR6Turbo.com, and it was only about 55 bucks on eBay. So as far as filters go, you know, if you're after a K&N or something like that, it's going to cost you probably double. This one looks like it's fairly well built, and apparently you can wash it and also re-oil it, so it is reusable in a sense. So let's get that dropped in. Seems to fit up pretty nicely. And now we should be able to put the top of the airbox back on. Four clips actually, there's a fourth one. There we go. And then the last one down the front here, there we go. Cool. All right, now we can get our snorkel put back on as well. So that's pretty cool. We've got two snorkels now. We've got the main one and then the one down there under the headlight. So we'll get our two screws put back in here. Cool. There we go. Job done. All right, so we've got our airbox, our new intake and everything reinstalled, looking fantastic. What I'm actually going to do next is we're going to be installing a oil catch can. So what does an oil catch can actually do? Well, what happens is, basically, there's this breather here in the top of the rocker cover. And the reason that's there is because when engines are running, especially turbocharged engines, there'll be a little bit of pressure from the cylinder every time the piston comes up to the top and compresses the intake charge which is inside that cylinder. A certain percentage will leak past the rings in the cylinder down into the crankcase of the engine. So that pressure which is building up inside the crankcase needs to be expelled somewhere. Now, because when you relieve the pressure from the crankcase of the engine, it's going to have some oil vapor, because you know the entire crankcase has got oil circulating pretty much everywhere throughout it, including the head and the valve train up the top here as well. So what happens is it comes out of this little breather here, it goes through this factory pipe, and it goes into the cold side of the engine intake. And of course it gets sucked down into the turbo, through the intercooler, back up in the hot side here, through the intake plenum, and then it gets burnt in the cylinders of the engine. Now the unfortunate thing about this, and it's a bigger issue on turbocharged engines like this one, is because they're running boost in the cylinders when you've got the turbo on boost. So there's going to be on average more pressure building up inside the crankcases, and then therefore more air and more oil coming through out into the intake and then going through into your engine. Now the unfortunate thing about that is, depending on the amount of oil vapor coming out through here into your intake, you can actually get oil building up through the entire intake system of your engine. So what an oil catch can actually does is it basically reroutes this connection. So what you're going to do is you're going to send the vapor that's coming out of this breather here through this line into one side of your oil catch can. And this one actually mounts over there in the corner behind the coolant reservoir. But what it does is it actually gives that oil vapor a chance to collect in the bottom of this can. And it's something you have to check periodically to make sure it hasn't filled up, and if it has, you have to empty it and then reinstall it. And that intake pressure, of course, gets fed through this can as well. The oil is caught in the can, which is why it's called an oil catch can, and then the vapor returns back down this line, which will have to route back through and then connect up to here. So this kit actually has a 10mm internal diameter hose, which seems to match up perfectly with this existing breather line. So what I reckon we're probably gonna have to do, connect one end of the hose up to it, find a way to snake it down behind the back of the engine to where the can is going to be installed. And then for the return line that comes back, we're probably gonna have to cut off a length here as well, and we can reinstall it back into there. There is a connection for that. Here's one I prepared earlier. There is a connection here, so that screws back in. And then we're gonna have a little length of pipe here so we can put our hose on with a hose clamp. So that's going to be the goal for today. It's probably not the neatest way to install an oil catch can, but until I can find some better fittings to accomplish this, I reckon this is gonna work absolutely fine. Now, if you're looking to buy an oil catch can for your Barra Turbo, Having a search on eBay actually returns some really interesting results. You'll see catch cans ranging from $265 through to $476, $330, $295, even up to $595. And sure, some of these kits contain extra fittings and mounting brackets, but really I don't want to be spending anywhere near that amount of money on an oil catch can. So after some searches, I actually found one for just $120 from Demon Pro Parts. It seems to be decent quality, and looking at the photos, it looks very similar to some of the $200 or $300 catch cans currently for sale on eBay. So I really wouldn't be surprised if some of them came out of the same factory from overseas. So installing the catch can itself is actually quite easy. All you need to do is back out one of the bolts holding on the coolant overflow reservoir and simply guide the bracket in underneath the coolant reservoir mounting point itself. Simply reinstall the bolt and the job is done. But of course we still need to connect the hoses to the engine. Firstly, we need to feed the hoses along the firewall to make sure they're routed safely to the passenger side of the engine. I personally found that the hose that needs to go to the breather on the tappet cover works really well if it goes underneath the cold side of the intake crossover piece. And then the hose which needs to connect to the cold side of the intake seems to work really nicely if you route it around the passenger side of the engine bay and then bring it in beside the throttle body. This will keep our installation looking fairly neat, which is definitely what I'm after. So to begin with, I'm actually going to connect the hose which returns from the oil catch can back to the cold side intake of the engine. And I'm going to do that by cutting the existing breather hose. This leaves me with roughly 1 or 2 centimeters of the existing line available, so I can clamp my new hose onto the end of it. So all I'm doing here is tightening up the hose clamp and then screwing the fitting back into the intake of the engine. With the return line fitted, I can then concentrate on fitting the connection which runs from the breather to the catch can itself. And what I'm doing here is using the existing breather line. I've got 2 of them, so this is my stock standard breather, which I'm going to leave uncut. This means I can retain the stock breather and then connect the hose to the end, which I can then hide under the crossover piece itself. I think this will probably be the neatest option available. And also it means I've got an uncut breather hose, so if I ever want to undo this modification, I should be able to do it pretty easily. So all you need to do is work out what sort of length hose you need, trim it to suit, and then connect it to the existing breather using a hose clamp. Once you've got your oil catch can hose attached, you can then attach the stock breather back to the tappet cover of the engine. Until I can find a better way to connect this oil catch can, I think this is going to have to do the job, and you know, I think it looks okay. So let's get the car out on the road and give it a test drive. Alright guys, so we're out on the road here. I've got the new Under-Headlight intake installed and a new air filter as well. Hopefully those 2 things I'm going to notice a difference with. The oil catch can is something we're not going to notice. It's really something that's there just to keep our intake nice and clean and free of oil. So that is nice. I'm not really expecting any additional power with these mods. There probably would be a small increase, I imagine. But yeah, if I notice any power increase today, it's a bit hard to tell. Is it placebo or is it actually a real gain? So I'm going to forget about that. I'm going to focus mainly on induction noise because that's something I definitely want to increase in this car. And because it does have the longer intake, which goes on the crossover through to the airbox, you do lose a bit of that turbo spooling noise. So hopefully that lower intake that goes under the headlight is going to increase our induction noise, because really we've put another hole in the airbox and it's really doubling the size of the hole that comes out of there. So hopefully it doubles the noise as well. So we'll cruise on through. There's an industrial estate over here. I'm not going there because I want to break any laws or anything. It's just that there's no one there on a weekend and, you know, we're not going to get in anyone's way. So we'll pull up just over here and we'll have a listen as we take off. I have to stay sort of half throttle-ish just because the clutch on this car is starting to struggle a little bit. Let's see how it sounds. Okay. All right, so if I had to estimate, I would say the induction noise in this car is probably twice as loud, and that's really sort of what I was expecting. And I reckon I would say the sound itself of the turbo spooling and also that flutter when you back off the throttle it does sound crisper, as if it's been unmuffled just a little bit extra. So yeah, I'm actually really happy with how that sounds. If you do want to keep your standard crossover and intake on your XR6 Turbo, I definitely would recommend that under-headlight intake if your car hasn't got one already. And you know, the performance air filter, like the one I fitted, certainly doesn't hurt. So we'll just head back out onto the main road here and we'll do one more pull. But yeah, I think for the price I paid, you know, the filter was about 50 bucks. And yeah, that under-headlight intake was about 100. And that's just because, you know, it's a Ford OEM part, and you are buying it online from Ford dealers, so it's not going to be the cheapest thing around, but to get that really professional factory OEM look, you can't go past it. I think it's a really good deal. Let's have a listen again. That'll do it. That'll do it. So what do you reckon, guys? I'm really happy with this intake modification. I know it was a little bit rough when I installed it, but due to the way that intake piping is designed, you really don't need to be too accurate with your cuts. I'm really happy with the end result. This car sounds really quite savage now, even though it does have the standard exhaust. It really does sound quite mean when you're on boost. So if you enjoyed the video, guys, please do consider subscribing, dropping me a like. That really is important. And yeah, check out some of the other videos I've got here on the side, and I'll see you next time.